I know we have, but they might be running a few minutes late. All right, so we'll do this pretty informally. Mihir, I guess if you want to just go ahead and just talk to us about your educational career and kind of how you wound up where you were, and then we'll let the students just ask questions.
Sure, yeah, please keep this as informal as possible. I think I have banished my children to the basement with a movie, but they may percolate in, and so forgive me if they should make a cameo. So I grew up in New York, actually. I grew up in Long Island, about an hour and a half out east in a town called Islip. The airport is there. That's like how most people know about Islip. And then I went to college at Brown up in Rhode Island. And then in college, I was interested in science. I wasn't entirely sure what I was going to do. I actually ended up majoring in ecology and evolutionary biology, and I was sort of on track to maybe have a career as a PhD in marine ecology. I saw myself kind of traveling the seas. But then sort of after, I had something happen to me in college that sort of changed a lot of how I thought about the world. Unfortunately, a good friend of mine passed away from a drug overdose when I was a junior in college. And that sort of like set me for a spin and kind of made me realign what my sort of personal, professional ambitions were. And I spent some time after college kind of thinking through that. I went to India, I'd worked there for about a year, and then I decided I wanted to do med school. It had always been sort of in the background. My parents are both doctors, and so I'm sort of in my blood, but I had tried to fight it. But ultimately, I came to sort of realize that I think it sort of meshed my personal interests in wanting to help people out as well as my interest in science pretty well. So that's why I ended up in medicine. Because of that event, though, I actually started Sinai thinking I was going to be a psychiatrist. And so I did some like early work with, I don't know if he's there, Alex Collison is a child psychiatrist, fantastic mentor. We did some work on like autism and pharmacology. But that sort of evolved probably by about third year to a pretty strong interest in internal medicine. I think that was mostly just by virtue of doing the clerkship. I had a couple of patients roll into the ICU when I was a medicine clerk. And I think that got me really passionate about physiology, about acuity, and things that I didn't think I'd be as exposed to in psychiatry. And so that's how I ended up applying into internal medicine, probably with a like 80% confidence that I was going to do pulmonary critical care. Ended up in residency at Mass General, which I was very happy to match into. I'm happy to talk about the program there because I know some of you guys are interested in applying into IM, potentially in the Boston programs. I did 3 years there. Like I said, I was pretty confident I wanted to do pulmonary critical care, and that was cemented within a couple of months of doing internship. I had an ICU month, like about like a third of the way into the year, and I just fell in love with it. I like the physiology in the ICU. I mean, we can talk a lot about like what drove me to critical care, but I'm not sure how relevant that is for everybody. I wasn't entirely sure sort of what my life was going to look like though after like finishing fellowship. I knew I wanted to apply into fellowship in pulmonary critical care, but I wasn't entirely clear about what my life was going to look like afterwards. I wanted to stay in academics just because I think everyone says you should, and I didn't know what that meant. I think I didn't know like what the different roles were, what the different niches were, what the different sort of like packages you can put together with. And I came from a place like MGH where like pulmonary critical care has come a long way in terms of the fellowship, but at the time it was really well known as being sort of a research powerhouse. It still is in many ways. And the pathway to success in academia seemed to be like doing research, getting a K, and then like moving on to sort of like this highbrow academic career where you get to travel the world and do presentations at ATS and the like. So
he means K like grant from the NIH, not K like ketamine.
Exactly. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Please jump in and so I can clarify. And so that's sort of the path I started on. And I had a couple of mentors during residency and then fellowship early on, in which I started doing research. I I was involved in like acute lung injury, ARDS, and so I met up with a guy who was doing translational research, which to me was kind of cool because it melded like basic science with like actual clinical application. But then about 6 months into that, I just realized that like a lot of mice had died. I hadn't learned, I had learned a lot, but I hadn't like accomplished much. And I was just getting really frustrated, and I kind of felt myself missing sort of that clinical aspect of it, the part that really speak to me, like at the bedside doing medicine. And I didn't find myself doing that forever. And so I switched gears again, and I found a subspecialty in pulmonary medicine called interventional pulmonology. It's it's now a bit more of an established field, but it's a subspecialty within pulmonary in which we do a lot of procedures in and around the lungs. And I liked it because it was new. It's exciting. There's a lot of growth for clinical development there. And I sort of liked that I got to use my hands a lot, which was one of the other reasons I picked pulmonary critical care medicine. So I did an extra year of training in pulmonary and critical care medicine. Oh, I forgot to mention, I went to San Francisco for fellowship, UCSF, for pulmonary and critical care. And then I spent another year there doing interventional pulmonary. And then,
So is that 3 or 4 years of residency, and then how many years of fellowship?
yeah, so good question. It was 3 years of medicine, 3 years of pulmonary critical care, and then 1 year of interventional pulmonology. So after med school, it was 7 years of training. And then I got my first job out here at Beth Israel. And you know, the reason I came to Beth Israel after fellowship was for a variety of reasons, partly involving my family. My wife and I, we met during residency, and then we got married. We couples matched for fellowship, and then we were doing the job hunt together. And so that was sort of like where the Venn diagrams of our job opportunities were best, ended up being back here in Boston. But another big reason why I ended up at the BI was that sort of throughout this sort of like search to find like my clinical academic space, I developed a very strong interest in medical education. I love being a teacher. I love working with trainees. I think it's, you know, I find myself becoming a better doctor every time I work with students, fellows, residents, and I just really like that level of energy that we get. And it's just, you know, like I see some of my colleagues who don't do as much med ed, and they just end up like sort of being by themselves a lot. And I like being part of a big group and a big team, and sort of like doing this collaborative style of medicine. And so that's why I came back to the BI, and I've been developing my career as a medical educator. And that's been in part doing some administrative work. Like I'm one of the associate program directors for the interventional fellowship here at the BI MGH. And then I do some work with the pulmonary critical care fellowship as well as the internal medicine residency. And then along with that, I've actually this year gone back to school a little bit. I'm doing an advanced fellowship in medical education that's like specific to early career faculty here at Harvard, which is awesome. It's like a group of 7 of us that we just sort of like have like-minded interests, and we just sort of teach each other about medical education with the help of our mentors in the fellowship. And sort of feels like I'm like surrounded by Dean Muller and like his ethos at times, which is a nice place to be. So that's sort of my journey. I don't know if that sort of captures what you wanted.
If you had gone into private practice, would you still have to be in the hospital setting, or?
In interventional pulmonology, yes. So there are people who do private practice interventional pulmonology, and they are again mostly in a hospital-based practice, meaning they spend about like, I would say like 50 to 70% of their time doing procedures, mostly in a hospital setting. They also have their clinic. And so that where I trained at UCSF for interventional pulmonary, it was a bit of a hybrid model. We had some time where we spent at UCSF proper, where there was a traditional academic model, but then sometime with some of the IP doctors who were in private practice in Palo Alto. And that gave me a little bit of a flavor as to what life outside of academia would be like. And they do half and half in their private clinics as well as half in the hospital, but a private hospital, not like a non-academic hospital.
Mm-hmm. And so I guess, you know, for the first years on the phone call, it sounds like you decided pretty early that you knew you wanted to do something. So how did that come about? Like, did you shadow doctors, or how did you know that was what you wanted to do? Because there's a lot of things that you can do procedures with, but.
Yeah, no, I struggled with it. So I sort of figured it out probably around second or third year, like I was saying, that I was more interested in not psychiatry, maybe more medicine. And I think that had a lot to do with just being in the hospital, doing the rotations and getting a better sense of it. I was speaking to a couple of, you know, friends who were in higher levels in med school than me, and they put me in touch with a couple of house staff, and that was kind of helpful too, to get their perspectives on what they'd done and how they'd made the decision. But I think a lot of it had to do just with like how excited I got pretty quickly with pulmonary and critical care as a
Mhm.
third year.
So I guess when the pandemic was in Boston, how did that shift in terms of what you were doing, or did it
Yeah.
shift?
No, it did. It was pretty nice because my first love was the ICU. And after about 7 years of training, I ended up doing interventional pulmonology, which is like a subspecialty of pulmonary. So I wasn't doing a lot of time in the ICU. I would do maybe about 4 or 6 weeks out of the year attending in the MICU at the BI. But then the pandemic came on, and it sort of, as I heard things went in New York, we sort of were surged pretty hard and had to open up. We usually have about we have 3 MICUs running at all times. So there's 3 faculty on service. But at the height of the surge, we were running 7 medical ICUs at the BI. And so we had to like increase our capacity quite a bit. And so that meant I came back to the ICU much more than I had been. I was pretty much from like March, late March into May, was doing sort of like several weeks a month. The other thing that changed a little bit is that when I did attend in the MICU, I attended on the fellow service. So at the BI, there's a service that's specifically run by the fellow, and that the fellow sort of takes the attending kind of role in the MICU. And sort of I, as the actual attending, am sort of just there to kind of bounce ideas off the fellow, but really it's an opportunity for the fellows to develop their attending level skills.
Mhm.
Which is nice, but that means that I oftentimes have to take a little bit of a backseat and keep my mouth shut on rounds, which is sometimes harder to do. But then when the surge hit, I actually got to have my own team, which was fun because I hadn't done that in a long time. It was me and 3 residents and 10 COVID patients. So it was a nice opportunity for me to kind of get back to the bedside and get back to sort of running and managing a team with
Mhm.
residents, which is, again, one of the things I really like to do because of the energy that comes from that.
What specialty is your wife?
She's an oncologist,
Mhm.
GI oncologist, MGH. Yeah.
So I guess I'm going to let the students ask questions because obviously this is for them. Dan or Lucas or Justin, do you guys have any questions? You want to start off with something?
Yeah, I have a quick question. Hi, Dr. Parikh.
Hey,
Thanks for
how's it
joining
going?
us.
Call me Mihir. Dr. Parikh. Too formal.
Okay. So how do you split your time between like the OR, the ICU, and clinic?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so one of the things I like about my job is that I'm not doing the same thing day to day, week to week, hour to hour. It changes a lot, and so it keeps me kind of, keeps me interested, keeps me excited. And so generally, I'll do 2 days in clinic and then 2 days in the OR doing procedures. Those are generally 2 pretty full days. I do have 1 day a week that's sort of like administrative, in which I sort of catch up on stuff, catch up on paperwork, catch up on like sort of non-clinical academic pursuits that I have. Like I do like the administrative positions I have for the educational programs we have. I also do some research on clinical education and procedural training that I work on. But but the other thing I do with my administrative day is I just come home and play with my kids. And I think this is something that, I'm happy to talk about more, because I think one of the things that I struggle with is the idea of like work-life balance and sort of how to find that. And I think it's something that we didn't really talk about in med school. And, like we talked about in the sense that like there are these certain specialties that are more, more likely to give you better work-life balance. I'm not sure that that's entirely true, but it's something that I'm working on a daily basis. Partly it's because my wife is a physician as well too, and with young kids, it's really important for us to make sure that that we have time for each other, time for a family, as well as time for our professional pursuits.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, especially as a surgeon. You think, okay, well, how can I have time to do anything else? But I think any specialty you go into, you can make your schedule into what you want it to be. So I definitely wouldn't shy away from picking a specialty just because you've heard that, it's all time consuming, because there's a lot of different avenues that you could pursue where you can still do the specialty that you like, but you can do it in a way so that it doesn't So you can do other things as well.
Yeah.
Can I have a
One
follow-up
of the
question
things I
with that?
didn't. Oh yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Just in terms of like being a physician and having a schedule, like who is in charge of actually making the schedule? Is it you, or is it like based on how your patients, what they ask for? Like who actually decides your day to day?
I don't actually know. No. It's a little bit of everything. And I think it has to do sort of with what situation you end up in. I think the benefits of being in private practice, traditionally have been that you get to create your own schedule. You get to pump the brakes or hit the gas whenever you want to. I think when you're part of like an academic center, just in terms of like who my boss is, like my boss is like the chief of thoracic surgery and interventional pulmonology at the BI, whose boss is the chairman of the chair of surgery at Beth Israel. And so, they're the people that kind of sort of I have to negotiate with in terms of what my day is going to look like. And that negotiation works in different ways. Some people have structures in place in which they're able to negotiate sort of like per day or per half day. Like, you're going to have like set half day of clinic, number of half days of clinic per week. And that is like what is built into your contract to like give you your salary. The way that my practice runs, it's sort of like they give us a target of, they're RVUs, and that's sort of like, I'm not sure how familiar people are with that term, but it's basically a unit of productivity in medicine. So from anything from like a clinic visit to like a lung transplant, everything has like an RVU associated with it. And so I have a target number of RVUs that I have to accomplish over the course of the year. And so I can sort of set my schedule based on that. And so like some weeks I will like, go up on my productivity if I get I'll get regular reminders over the course of the year as to like where I am in relationship to those targets. And so I can either pump the grass, or maybe if I'm doing really well, I might, take a break and take a day off here or there with it. And so, along with that comes a lot more complexity in terms of like, how do I create these RVUs in terms of, my ability to have protected time in the operating room versus my ability to have like efficiency in my clinic. And, that a lot of that is sort of like dependent on people's unique circumstances, but that's sort of how I create my day. I wanted to go back to what you were saying, Alexis, about like the keeping your minds open to specialties that you may not think might be right for you from a work-life balance perspective, because I think that's very true. I don't think I fully appreciated that because you have such a sort of like a tunneled vision of what like life and different careers can be based on what you experience in medical school. Like most of the time that's dealing with residents in that subspecial or specialty whose lives thankfully are nothing like what the vast majority of attendings are like, from a work-life balance perspective. And even within sort of attending career paths, like there's so much you can do between sort of like clinical practice versus administrative positions versus like educational roles, research roles, health policy roles, that I think, it's important to kind of like keep your mind open, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to get exposure to it when you're a student, because you're mainly around residents who, a lot of times are hating life because they're resident.
Yeah.
Their specialty.
Yeah.
But I think like maybe seeking out, like you're saying, like people who have slightly different, aren't just the straight clinician, and are doing other things, so that you can actually get an idea of what else there is possible to do there. And so like one thing that we've tried to do is also find alums who are doing things that are completely outside the box. Like we've had like writers or people that started their own companies and stuff, because you're just not going to see that when you're a medical student unless they sort of come to you, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then Lucas, your question about like setting your hours, I think that's completely dependent on whatever situation you're in. So like for me, we sort of have like a private practice within an academic model. So like I kind of set when I'm going to see patients and when I'm going to be in surgeries. So I have some flexibility in that too. Justin or Dan, do you guys have any questions?
Yeah, I had a question. Given your experience with like multiple HMS associated programs, either being like a resident at MGH or attending at BI, could you talk a little bit about like the differences between the programs in terms of like resident education, culture, maybe some of the stuff that'll be more like harder to assess this year, given we're all just visiting virtually?
Yeah. No, I certainly sympathize for you guys. I thinking back to all the transitions I had from like, college to med school to residency and fellowship and even my job, like you use kind of like that visit to kind of get a sense of the vibe of the place, right? To get a sense of the culture, the personalities, the mood. And that gut feeling is so much harder to get in these virtual formats. And so, I encourage you to sort of reach out to alumni because I think we have alumni kind of populated everywhere at this point. But in terms of like the Boston programs in internal medicine, I think they're probably more alike than they are different. I'll start there. For better or for worse, Harvard's a pretty inbred place. It's sort of like a game of musical chairs. Here, faculty kind of move around to different institutions with some regularity. And so, like for example, like I'm not the only former MGH resident who's on staff at the BI. There's a couple of us, like a couple of my actual former residents are now my colleagues. I think I'll start with the clinical training sort of at these three institutions. I'm going to talk, I don't know a lot about Mount Auburn. I'll throw that out there. So I'm not going to include that one because I'm honestly not familiar with it. But in terms of the Brigham, the BI, and MGH, I think clinical training is fairly comparable at all three of them. I think each of them have are large quaternary medical centers that are going to give you sort of a wide exposure to internal medicine. I think some of them have a little bit more sort of subspecialty stuff. Like for example, like within pulmonary, MGH and the Brigham both have lung transplant programs, whereas the BI doesn't. I think, to the contrary, we have a much more established interventional pulmonary program than either of those two hospitals. We've been at the IP group here at the Brigham, at the BI has been around for, over 20 years, and where they're relatively new at the other institutions. So there are some sort of idiosyncrasies. I'm happy to sort of, if you have a specific interest in internal medicine, we can talk about that. But clinically, I think they're both very good. I think, they universally, from a clinical perspective, suffer from the lack of diversity that is present in Boston compared to a place like New York City. I think that's important to note. While there are large immigrant populations and large working class populations here in Boston, they're not primarily served by the Harvard hospitals. Boston University Medical Center and Tufts Medical Center are located in some of the more immigrant-rich, certainly poorer neighborhoods of Boston. And so you get to see a little bit more of that, like that Elmhurst vibe out there. But that being said, the thing about Massachusetts is that, about Boston, which always surprised me, was I was like so surprised that there are so many like medical centers in this like small-ish city compared to New York, like where all these patients coming from, and they come from everywhere. So we have patients flown in from like Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, upstate New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut, all the time. And so the catchment area for these institutions is pretty big. So with that comes a lot of clinical diversity, maybe not socioeconomic, maybe not racial diversity, but certainly clinical diversity. And so I think then moving a little bit more towards sort of like the cultures of the institutions, again, I think they're more alike than they are apart. I think the BI has a reputation, which I think is probably well earned, of being, a little bit of sort of like the joke is that it's Harvard with a heart. I think people here there's a really strong sense of camaraderie and collegiality here at the BI, which is, one of the things I love most about it. With the level of intellectual power and clinical prowess here, you'd expect there to be some ego, but there's really not there at all levels. That being said, like the MGH and Brigham are not like malignant places by any means. I don't think that's the case. What I valued, one of the things I valued most about my time at MGH, I think, was the level of autonomy I got as a trainee. I think it's something that has been part of the culture of the medicine residency since like the beginning of time, that house staff get a lot of ownership with patient care. And I really valued that because it really sort of invokes a sense of ownership over your patients, and that I think really helps us learn a lot better as well. The Brigham is a wonderful place as well too. I've had good friends that come out of there. Their cardiology programs are particularly strong. They also have a great vibe about them. Their program director, Joel Katz, has been there for a long, long time, and he has, they were going to do I remember a good friend of mine's a Brigham alum, and they were doing like a big sort of, I forget if it was like his 20th year or some big year of him being program director. And this spring they were planning on having this huge celebration for him with faculty, former residents coming in from all over the world to do that. Unfortunately, that was canceled because of the pandemic. But I think it's a good place to train. I don't think you can honestly go wrong with any of these three programs. I think a lot of it has to do with your personality and whether or not I remember that when I was doing interviews, I went out to the MGH night, and it was nice. It was very nice. It was like kind of like a shishi-ish restaurant in Beacon Hill, right close to the hospital. And then like a week later, I came back for my BI interview, and they took us out to like the Boston Beer Works, and they just put like an open tab on the bar and a bunch of house staff and us, and it just seemed like it was a very like family feel kind of vibe to it, which I liked a lot. So I don't know if that helps. I don't know if that answers your question.
Do you help evaluate applicants at any stage?
Yeah, so I do residency and fellowship applications for the pulmonary and the internal medicine training programs.
And so what, I guess if you could give advice to Dan, what would you say would be important to highlight, or recommendation letters, or what process would be?
I'm just gonna tell my kid that she can watch a movie. I'll be right back. Yes, you can.
On YouTube?
Yeah.
From that thing?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go.
Sorry. And sort of advice I would give for the application process for residency, is that right?
Yeah.
I think that the main thing that people want to hear is sort of like, what is it about you that's interested in internal medicine? Like what draws you to it? What makes you excited about it? I think people feel like they need to have this, you feel like you need to have it all figured out, and have to have like this whole like career pathway planned out. I hope that's not the case, or I hope you don't feel that way, because no one expects that. I think we just want to hear from you that you're passionate about medicine. I think passion is one of the most important determinants of success in any endeavor, particularly in medicine. And what it is about you or what is it about medicine that makes you so excited? And I think, I think personally, when I'm reviewing applications, I get impressed when people have like publications or like presentations or whatever, but it's really like when letter writers speak about sort of integrity, trustworthiness, sort of like even temperedness, maturity, those are the things that really speak out to me, because, all of those academic prizes will eventually come if you're passionate and hardworking. The things that, and the residency, that the whole point of residency is to build you towards that path. Like what we can't do during residency is make you a good person, right? And like if you're not a good person, if you're not a good team player, then it's going to make your success at the residency not very good, and it's also going to impair the success of others around you. So that's what I would try to highlight.
That makes sense, and thanks so much for your answer too. It's nice to hear from somebody who's been like through a couple of those programs, just your opinion, your take on them, because it's funny talking to some of the residents. I'll talk to a resident at MGH, and he'll be like, "Yeah, MGH is man's greatest hospital. It's better than the other ones." And then I'll talk to someone at Brigham, and they'll be like, "Well, MGH is kind of a malignant culture, and Brigham is better here." And so it's nice to also hear from like a higher up level that the similarities are greater than the differences. And
yeah. And that sort of stuff about MGH being malignant has been around for a long time. It was there when I was applying as well too. I honestly don't think it's true. Some of our closest friends, I guess my wife is from MGH, I should start that, but some of our closest friends are still from MGH, and it's really a formative time, and you spend so much time in MGH that if it was truly malignant, you would just explode. But it's really a wonderful place.
That's great to hear. Thank you.
So, Dr. Parikh, just one question. So you've trained both on the East Coast and West Coast. Would you say there are major like cultural differences in the practice of medicine on like either side of the country?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I'll start by saying that it's probably that they're more similar than they are separate. And I think that again has a lot to do with like once you get to these certain tier of institutions, there are a lot of the same people at them. And so I can speak mostly to my time at UCSF and contrast that with my time here in Boston. I think um, I think there are important cultural differences between them, despite some strong similarities. One of them I think is just this concept of work-life balance. Um, I think it's something that we struggle with here in Boston and at the Harvard programs. I think people are very passionate about what they do um, here, and it shows so much so that they put in a lot of time and a lot of effort to do that. And I think it's a testament to how passionate they are about their work in medicine. I think I found in California that people were also oftentimes passionate about what their life could be like outside the hospital as well. And so that could mean things like, surfing, for example, which is like a commonly practice hobby. I tried, failed, but a lot of people are better at it than me. Or other sort of non-hospital related pursuits, anything from like backpacking, hiking, biking, camping, being outdoors, cooking, wine tasting, and the like. And I often found that on the weekends or on a Monday, people would like come back and talk about what they did over the weekend in a very excited manner. Whereas for better or for worse, that doesn't happen here in Boston. Conversations oftentimes revolve around like, I got this grant, or like I got funded for this really cool thing, or like I'm gonna like be this, like I'm gonna head this new initiative on like whatever in the hospital. And so and people are very excited about that. Whereas I think there are some, I don't know, and that would be my bias because I'm in a place in which I wish I had more of that California lifestyle again. And it may be a little bit of the grass is always greener. It may be a little bit of the fact that I was like young and didn't have young children when I was living in California, so I could do a lot more of these things than I can now, practically speaking. But I think those were sort of one of the important differences. I think one of the things I remember most is like at MGH.
Sorry, what about like the actual practice of medicine?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, obviously the quality is probably equally good, but just in terms of like philosophy and stuff, did you notice any difference with that?
No, I don't know that I did, actually. I'm trying to think. That's a great question. I think there was still a lot of focus on autonomy and ownership as a fellow, which I liked. There was a strong belief in evidence-based medicine, which, again, I believed in quite strongly. I think there was a commitment to interdisciplinary care. I was part of the pulmonary critical care fellowship, but we had anesthesiologists come rotate with us. And so there was a lot of collaboration between different groups. I think culturally things were a little different. Like I remember like at MGH, your attendings were always Dr. So-and-so, whereas at UCSF, it was like first name basis, kind of like with everybody. I spent the first like week or two as a pulmonary fellow in San Francisco, like showing up with a tie and realizing that I'm like the only one wearing a tie. Like 3 months in, my like MICU attending walks into rounds on a Saturday wearing like a sweater and Birkenstocks, and I was like, okay, this is like very different.
They've done studies looking at what doctors are wearing and patient perception.
Yeah.
But I guess probably in California, they maybe just don't care as much. Like it doesn't affect their perception as much.
Right. Yeah. No, I think everyone just sort of doesn't think much about it.
Yeah.
Because I feel like you can be going out to dinner and like the guy in like the black hoodie next to you could be like a like multi-billionaire like software developer.
Anything. Yeah.
That's a great question though. I don't know. I think the jury's still out on that in my mind as to like whether or not there are significant differences between the two coasts. But what I do believe in is I feel very good that I actually changed institutions. Not a lot of people, not everyone does that. Like a lot of people sort of end up at the same institution, like oftentimes through medical school up until their first job. And I think it's really important to try to branch out and try different places. As much as I believe in evidence-based medicine, there isn't evidence for everything. And so sometimes a lot of what we do is based on expert consensus, or like, I do it this way because it's the right way to do it. And the only way I know it's the right way to do it is because I was taught to do it this way. And so like, when you go to multiple different places, you can understand that there are multiple different perspectives. There's different ways to approach any clinical problem, and not every one of those is wrong or right. They each have their merits in any individual situation. So.
Yeah, I would say also, I don't know what your fellowship was like, but I felt like for fellowship, it was also important to go somewhere where there's a lot of different people that you rotate with, so you can see a lot of different ways of doing it, versus some which are like just a straight mentorship model where you're really just with one person the whole time, which can be good for, you know, certain things. But what's the fellowship like that that is at BI?
Well, say it again.
This fellowship at the BI, is it multiple attendings, or is it mainly?
Yeah, we have in IP, we have 3 different faculty members here. So you get a sort of a flavor. Each of us was trained at a different pedigree as well too, which is nice. So you get a little bit of a flavor of each of us and sort of pick and choose what you're interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of and then along those lines, getting back to your question, Daniel, about like, you know, picking programs. I think the other thing that is important to discuss is that like the MGH is just the MGH, meaning you do like the vast majority of rotations at MGH, whereas at the other programs like the Brigham and the BI, you do have rotations at other institutions like the VA hospitals, the Faulkner Hospital, which is a community hospital at the Brigham. And so that gives you a little bit more diversity. That's one of the things I loved about UCSF, my fellowship there, is because we had like sort of the 3 hospital systems. So you got to see a little bit of everything. You got to see like at UCSF proper, it was like, you know, the typical quaternary institution where like, you know, there's like all these strange and wonderful and exciting, but very, very specialized problems happening. And then there's the VA in San Francisco, which is like a VA institution that has a different set of problems, particularly in pulmonary medicine, where, you know, smoking is so prevalent in the veteran population. We got to see a lot there. And then there was San Francisco General, which was a large community hospital, you know, city-based hospital that you got to see, you know, a lot of interesting presentations of diseases from all around the world because of the large number of immigrants that lived in that part of the city.
Yeah, I could totally see the value of that, especially after being at Sinai. I mean, within the Sinai system, you can go from main hospital out to Elmhurst and see a million different infectious disease things, or the populations definitely differ.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you guys still rotate at Elmhurst, right? That hasn't changed?
We do. It's awesome.
So I have to ask you, why is it the before every hospital name? You know, because we have Beth Israel, that's part of Mount Sinai, but we don't call it the.
I don't know. That's just a Boston thing, I guess.
It's a very.
Oh, MGH, yeah. It might be a Boston arrogant thing. I don't know.
So if you had free time now, what do you think you would actually want to be doing that's not academic or not related?
That is a great question. You know, I have the hobbies that I would like to develop. You know, I've always wanted to be a better cook, and so I've been working on that, particularly during the pandemic. I was one of the early adopters of the sourdough phenomenon, and so
I did say sourdough. Did you grow green onions also?
I did not grow green onions. We grew tomatoes, which is something I hadn't done before. And then, so I've been working on cooking a little bit more because I do like to eat. That was one of the other things I learned about myself in San Francisco, where the food is fantastic. And then
Boston is not as good, or?
No, no, I'm sorry to share that. Boston's got good food, but I think when you live in places like New York City and San Francisco, it's hard to beat those 2 locations for culinary prowess. Other things I would like to do more of. So I would like to be outdoors more, and it's getting a little harder to do that. But I took my daughters camping for the first time. We used to camp a lot before we had kids, but we sort of stopped when the girls were born, and so we went out camping this past summer, which was great. They actually did really, really well. And so I would like to explore that a bit more.
Where did you take them?
We went out to a lake out in Western Massachusetts, and it was really nice. They had a wonderful time, sleeping in their sleeping bags, roasting marshmallows. We went hiking and canoeing, swimming in the lake. It was fantastic. There are, you know, here in New England, as much as I'm trying not to bash Boston too much to the New York crowd, but New England is fantastic. Like there's so much to do. New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine have wonderful hiking routes, and so I want to try to get out there next year a bit more if I can. And then just reading. I used to read a lot, and then I think now between like work and then coming home with the kids and doing bedtime and packing lunches and the like, it just gets harder to have the energy to do much like when you hit the bed.
Yeah.
But I've been trying to read a bit more and just kind of explore that world a bit.
How old are your daughters?
4 and 5.
Okay. So you're doing this medical school education thing right now. What do you think like your next educational, like postgraduate schooling would be, if you could do it?
In terms of what I want to kind of grow out of this
Yeah.
fellowship that I'm doing, I want to take on more administrative roles in education. I think ultimately I'd like to become the program director for the Interventional Pulmonary Fellowship, as well as take on more leadership roles with the Pulmonary Critical Care Fellowship. I think one of the things that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about is the importance of mentorship along the way, and I think that it's really important to find good mentors. And the mentor doesn't have to be necessarily the person whose job you want to have. It's just someone who believes in you and you feel comfortable talking about openly with some of these things, so you can have a bit of a sounding board with someone who's spent more time or seen more or experienced more in sort of medical worlds than you might have. And I had a whole series of those, starting with Alex Collison, who was a psychiatrist and who sort of helped me understand think through like the program match when I was doing internal medicine. And then, researchers that I worked with as a pulmonary fellow, even when I told them that I didn't want to do their research anymore, I still was able to count them as mentors and kind of like help me think through what the next steps are going to be. I think, and I want to sort of pay that back, and I think the ways to pay that back are to continue to be engaged with people like you guys who are like still working on developing your professional and personal goals, and kind of be a sounding board and help you make your decisions reflecting back on the decisions I made.
Who do you think who do you go to now for advice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I go to my wife a lot. I think she's been a good mentor to me at this part of my life. She has come to a lot of these decisions with less naivety than I think I have, and so I think she's got a little bit more of a solid foundation in reality than I sometimes do. And then my other mentors that I speak with regularly are my boss now, who's the chief of thoracics. He's actually a fantastic mentor in the sense that he certainly has his interests or his particular interest when it comes to my development based on what he wants me to do in terms of the clinical volume or the educational programs in the division. But he also, believes quite strongly in who I am and what I want to be. And so he's a good both sounding board as well as an advocate, because he has a lot more power. The sort of the leader of my fellowship program is a woman named Grace Wong. She's a clinical educator, practicing hospitalist at Beth Israel, and she just has this sort of very Zen-like approach to most things, which helped me sort of like I can sort of like have a bit of like word vomit on her, and she'll like synthesize my concerns, mirror them back to me, but also like help me figure out what to do with that in like 30 seconds, which is great.
Yeah, I think that the med students are usually matched up with like an advisor or something like that, but that person doesn't also, I think the thing with mentorship, it's not always like you go and contact someone and they suddenly become your mentor. It's like, it really is like something you have to develop, and it may not be the first 1, 2, or even 5 people you reach out to before you figure out who is actually someone that you can trust and actually will give you good advice, I think.
Yeah, I think trust is an important part of that. And it's hard sometimes when you're in a junior position, because you feel like you're constantly being evaluated by everybody, which in some cases you are, right? You're in medical school and these are like your faculty, but at the same time, like you want to be able to like speak openly. I think that's one. I don't have a lot of regrets, but I think I wish I had been more confident in myself to know about myself what I really wanted and be able to speak that confidently. Like when I was applying from residency to pulmonary fellowship, I did this whole like bit in my personal statement and on the interview trail about how I was going to study like do a translational research project in acute lung injury, ARDS, partly because I thought that was like the path I should be on, not necessarily the path I wanted to be on.
Mm.
And I kind of wish I was a little bit more confident to say, no, actually, I really want to do medical education, even though this is not like exciting to you and will not lead to like all this NIH funding and, international acclaim. Like, it's really what I'm passionate about. And I think, I want to empower all of you guys to do that, because like I said, like, success is not going to come from like being on the path that you think you should be on. Success is going to come from being on a path that you're passionate about.
Yeah, it's funny because I think like if you were looking at an interview or looking at application, I think the key is, yes, something that you're passionate about. So probably if you had written that essay, someone would have said like, oh, finally someone who just doesn't want to talk about the research, but is actually talking about something else that's kind of unique.
Yeah.
And so it actually would have been probably just as compelling to, of an application. Any questions?
So I see that you do a lot of work with simulation,
Mhm.
especially with like bronchoscopy and pleural procedures. I was just wondering if you could speak on like what you think the future role that simulation will play in the training of the future physicians.
Yeah, I think it's going to play an ever increasing role. I think I think the pandemic put that into light for all of us, right? I think we are going to have to learn how to do things sort of remotely from the patient sometimes. I think from a safety perspective, it necessarily has to be the case. And I feel like we're reaching a point where the old training philosophies used to be like see one, do one, teach one, right? And I think that doesn't necessarily work all the time. It's particularly when you're not seeing a lot of these different procedures being done or having the opportunity to do them. And so being able to do them in the simulation space provides a much sort of more reliable chance that you're going to be able to get your hands on, and at least in a simulated environment, on a particular procedure, and at least be able to sort of demonstrate on some sort of fidelity mannequin like how well you can do that. My particular interest in is trying to understand how simulation can be used from like an assessment perspective as well too, right? Because nowadays, like, whatever field you go into, I'm going to talk about pulmonary just because that's what I do, but like we say you can be you're credentialed to do bronchoscopies or thoracentesis because you've done like 50 of them, some arbitrarily created number that is not evidence-based, and forgets the fact that 50 procedures for me is not the same as 50 procedures for you, that learning is very individualistic, and each of us are on this learning curve at a different point, and the curve itself is different for each and every one of us. And so I think using things like simulation to really identify where someone is on the curve, and also when we feel comfortable allowing that person to do it independently, is a much better tool than having them sort of do it on a patient. Where the future is going, I actually had a really interesting call with some folks over at MIT recently about virtual reality and sort of how to bring virtual reality into the sim space. I'm not a gamer by any means, but like it could, I think there's a lot of potential there to sort of bring simulation to like the next level, where you are in a in a sort of three-dimensional simulation space that you can interact with in ways that we hadn't had the fidelity to do before. So I'm excited to see what that can bring.
Dan or Lucas, any other last questions?
I have one question. Given your background in the ICU, and I know you can get to an ICU kind of through different routes, through like pulmonary, like you did, or through emergency medicine, or through anesthesiology. I'm wondering if you, in your time, noticed any difference in ability to attend the ICU based on the background that they come from.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a lot of it has to do with what ICU we're talking about. Not all ICUs are sort of made the same. Each particular type of ICU has different patient populations in it. And so I think, you guys all know my biases. I'm medicine trained, I'm pulmonary critical care trained. And so I think in a MICU, patient care is probably delivered best by someone who's got a medicine training. And I think that's largely because we have medicine patients in a MICU, and there are complex medical disorders, complex renal disease, cardiovascular disease, pulmonary disease, rheumatologic disease, whatever, like that medicine people have that background in that other disciplines like anesthesia, emergency medicine, and surgically trained folks may not have. And so that's why I personally feel like a MICU faculty or a MICU attending should have medical training. That's, you contrast that with like a SICU, like a surgical intensive care unit. Like I have very little experience taking care of a postoperative patient. I'm learning, right? We have mixed units here that I've trained in the past, as well as some that I attend on here at Beth Israel, that I'm learning about how to do that, but it's a lot of back and forth with the surgical services because I just don't know how physiology changes after surgery. Similarly with like trauma issues, like I don't know, like, most of my patients are like, have had these chronic medical problems for years and years and years. They haven't just acutely had this huge traumatic event to them. So I think in the trauma ICU, a surgical ICU, sometimes it is better for the patients to have someone with a more surgical mentality, either through anesthesia or through, surgical training programs where they have a little bit more of that know-how. The other thing that I think has been an issue, and that's again my bias, is that I think for a variety of reasons, procedural training has started to suffer in internal medicine residency programs, and that has led to then pulmonary critical care fellows not having as much procedural training as some of their colleagues in like anesthesia, for example, where anesthesiologists routinely place central lines on IVs, on procedures, on patients. Surgical trainees routinely place chest tubes and do thoras and the like on their patients, and so their hands are a little bit more comfortable than some of the trainees I see coming from medicine programs. But that's not a fatal flaw. I think that is something that, again, we can teach, but it just requires a little bit more prowess to it. I think it's a great question. I honestly don't know the answer to it. And I think each of us has our biases. We have a very close relationship with the anesthesia critical care staff at Beth Israel. And then I see, a lot of their strengths compared to my training, but I also see deficiencies as well too. I think, like I said, the physiology that we get to learn about as medicine house staff is something that is hard to replicate.
What kind of same opportunities are available for the internal medicine residents at BI?
So it's pretty significant. We have the house staff start very early on from like intern boot camp, doing everything from like central line insertion in the simulation space to communication training, like, having end of life discussions, sort of those kinds of like role playing things that we do in the simulation space quite regularly. We have a pretty high fidelity ultrasound simulator, as well as real patients that we oftentimes bring in with interesting echo findings on them. So there's a lot that happens. We have several of our faculty who are in charge of the simulation curriculum for the house staff, and they've done a really wonderful job on it. Yeah, it's something to ask about, certainly on your interview trail, because I think something, we sort of assume that you're going to get exposed to every patient situation through the course of your residency, but that's certainly not true. And the simulation space is really there to help fill in those gaps of what you're seeing.
So which hospital did you say you consider to be the Elmhurst of Boston?
It's probably like Boston Medical or Tufts. They certainly have more sort of immigrant populations. They're located in the poorer parts of Boston, and so I think they tend to see that a little bit more than we do. Mm-hmm. Like the street in front of BU Medical Center is, nicely named Methadone Mile for. And then you drive down it, and you understand why it's called Methadone Mile, unfortunately. But yeah, so I think they get to see sort of a little bit of a different patient population than we do at places like Brigham. But yeah, you're making me so self-conscious about saying the now. So I'm like trying at Brigham, MGH, and BI.
All right. Well, I guess I want to keep you on time, and I know you have some little ones to get to, but thank you so much for getting for responding and being a part of it. And yeah, great. We'll definitely shoot people your way if they're interested in, your specialty or applying to Harvard and that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is great. Thanks so much, you guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you
Mihir.
very much.
Have a good
Thank
evening.
you.
Yeah, and don't hesitate to reach out if anything comes up. Happy to help.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Good night.